All right, everyone, we're ready to get started again. Glad to see you all in there with playbills and looking at materials in the last session. And up next, we have two speakers who did not send me their bios, so if I'm doing my best based on their online presence. This is a digital conference after all. But I have to forgive them because one of them is very sick, and he's here anyway, so he gets points. So Michael Gamer is a professor of English here in the English department at Penn. His two most recent books are Romanticism, Self-Canonization, and The Business of Poetry, which came out from Cambridge in 2017, and Interacting with Print, Modes of Reading in the Age of Print Saturation, which is, and I love this, a part of a multi-graph collective. Maybe he can, tell you later exactly what all that entails, but it's very exciting. He's currently the associate editor of the journal EIR, Essays in Romanticism, and he's working on a book on melodrama and a digital project asking what playbills read en masse can tell us, and I think that's what we're going to hear about right now. And I'm also going to, it's not enough. I've got to introduce Scott. I had your page up, Scott, and now it's gone. Okay. So Scott Enderle, I can say without even looking at his webpage, is a staff member here at Penn Libraries. Before coming to Penn, he was visiting assistant professor of English at Skidmore College, where he taught courses and mentored research on digital humanities and 18th century literature. In addition, he has more than 10 years of programming experience, and some of his research involves interpreting the networks produced by topic modeling, as well as text mining, archival research, and data visualization. He holds a BA in English from Texas A&M, an MA and a PhD in English literature from right here at Penn. And in 2010 to 2011, he was the recipient of the Bristol Schoenberg Fellowship in the History of Material Texts at Penn Libraries, which I didn't even know, but those of the Penn people in the room know that the Material Text is a long-running seminar here in which we talk about physical objects in a very enthusiastic way, and Scott was helping make all that happen for a while. So without further ado, Scott Enderle and Michael Gamer.
Thanks. So you can try to figure out which one of us is sick. If you watch The Simpsons, I'm Selma. And I just want to make sure that I know how this clicker works. All right, that's how it works. So hi, thanks for being here. I'm sorry I wasn't here early, but frankly, I think you should disinfect this entire podium after I get done with it. Scott and I are here to tell you a bit about a project. Can you hear me all right? Yep. Scott and I are here to tell you a bit about a project we've been working on, one that began with a very simple question: what can playbills tell us? That is, beyond what they're designed to tell us, that a given performance will take place at a given time, venue, and price, usually with certain performers and roles named. And while today we'll be focusing on questions of big data and aggregation, that is, what questions you can ask when you have a lot of playbills, geographically and temporally located and concentrated, I'd be lying if I didn't say that much of our initial interest arose out of the documents themselves. You can see here, I'd really want to know what the haunted kitchen with the dying scene is, though I think I know what it feels like. Because a lot of the playbills are zanily delightful. So let me give you a brief history of how the project evolved, because it's funny. We're both cultural historians of the 18th and 19th centuries. Some of my work over the last years is focused on British theater from these years. And for theater historians, the Data Bible has been the London stage for half a century. It's an exhaustive resource of what played where, when at London's major theaters, coming out of, playbills mostly, but also reviews of performances, theater account scrapbooks, and private and published accounts of viewers. And it's a wonderful resource, yet the title alone will give you a sense of its limitations. For one thing, the London stage stops smack in the middle of the Romantic period, and I'm a Romanticist, and it pisses me off. But it also focuses exclusively on the major theaters and the opera house, ignoring the so-called illegitimate performances, venues like Ashley's Circus, not to mention theaters like Sadler's Wells and the Adelphi, both of which are still in operation today. If that's a minor theater, then, well, they have a problem. Given the scale of the London Stage Project, and I adore this book, it's understandable why they needed to limit its scope. Still, I mourn that no such resource exists for provincial theaters or after 1800, because both things are fascinating for what they can tell us about the dissemination of culture. So Scott and I were talking about these issues back in 2016, and we thought it would be a good place to start to create a database, much like the English novels database Rachel Burma has been working on so well for so long, because we thought richly tagging playbills, which are really complicated documents, I'll just go back to that for a minute so you can start to contemplate it. Tagging them in rich ways would be very useful. That was our initial idea, and we tagged some 1,000 over 2 summers, Penn's provincial holdings and post-1800 holdings, and also those held by the Lewis Walpole and a few other local libraries. At this same moment, though, a game changer happened. The British Library digitized and put online their entire corpus of 100,000 playbills in PDF form. Many of them are post-1800, in fact, most, and many of them are provincial. These appeared on large PDF files of roughly 300 playbills apiece. They're huge, and the British Library provided OCR for each of the PDFs. And this is where our paper really begins, because here should have been a treasure trove of data, which it is, except that the quality of the OCR provided by the British Library is so bad as to render it, if not quite useless, I'll just say something less than we'd hoped. So for the time, we continued working on the database, and it takes about 20 to 30 minutes to enter in a playbill, so it's very inefficient. But at the same time, we were taking up a generous offer by Texas A&M's DH Lab to re-OCR the PDFs for us, using a variety of tools like Tesseract 3 and 4. But they also had a new license they were excited about with Google Cloud Vision if we were willing to pay for our usage, which we did, and our usage was considerable. And I'm going to give you Scott and give my voice a rest.
So the various expected problems occurred with uploading 100 gigabytes of data, particularly since we needed to divide the PDFs into single playbills with all the fun of naming and categorizing some 100,000 separate files. By the end of the past summer, however, we had the new OCR. We expected it to be better. In fact, it was much, much better. Oh, yes. Thank you. Much, much better. In preparation for this paper, we performed a number of comparative tests on it. We'd be happy to give you the details of those in Q&A, but suffice to say that the new OCR reduces the word error rate by 70% to 80%, and it does so over 7 decades of playbills, so markedly different from one another. Consider the difference between these two, which are only 12 years apart, that we have put aside the database work for the moment to put it to work exclusively on the OCR. So here's an example taken at random, a playbill of the oratorio that was to open for the new Drury Lane Theatre in 1794. Here's the British Library OCR. Here's the OCR we did this summer. Here they are side by side. As you can see, a noticeable improvement, and one that, in our view, is good enough for us to begin asking questions with something like confidence. We'll end the paper with an example of what kinds of questions we began asking, but first let's consider the question of OCR itself, both the issues raised by it, and why recent developments have suddenly improved our ability to machine read historical documents. 5 years ago, here was the state of the art in the OCR. Train computers to look at letters, just letters, and identify them. Use lots of labeled letter data and lots of computers, and this worked pretty well for a very specific subset of texts, written using select few modern typefaces laid out in uniform lines on a page. When Michael and I were first talking about the project, he asked me whether I thought we could use OCR to accumulate a large database of information about provincial playbills, and I said, I didn't actually say this. I said, imagine you teach an extraterrestrial to transcribe this, but without teaching them anything about English or writing or words or such classics as Goldilocks and the Three Bears. The extraterrestrial could probably do it. Sure, right? But then you ask them to transcribe this. So this turns out to have been a problem, and I guess I'll just pause and point out, those are bears. Those letters are literally bears. If you didn't notice, yeah, and then there are little fairies sort of like swimming through the fairy letters. So this problem, I think, is illustrated most dramatically by playbills like this, but it turns out to have been a problem for many, many projects. So some of you may know about the recent report by Ryan Cordell and David Smith on historical OCR. And here's what they have to say about this. Sadly, we couldn't render this in teddy bear font. Both NEH and Mellon staff have funded many projects over the years whose directors have reported back that the progress of their work was stymied by poor quality OCR. In some cases, this meant a huge delay in the project, as text had to be manually cleaned. In other cases, it meant using entirely different text corpora simply to avoid poor OCR. However, there's some good news. What has happened is that in the last 5 years, computer scientists have figured out how to teach the extraterrestrial, by which I mean the computer, English. Well, enough of English to be useful, at least in the context of OCR. Advanced OCR engines, like the one Google uses, use neural networks to make inferences about language rather than just looking at images of characters. They can see a word composed with a piece of broken type and do some computations that say roughly this. Knurs is not a word, but nose is, and makes sense in context. So this word is probably nose and not news or something else like gnaws. The computer still isn't as good at this as an actual human would be, but it makes a huge difference in performance. So as a result, it's become possible to do new things with Playbill data at scale. We still can't rely on OCR without doing some hand curation, but we can rely on OCR to reach roughly 90% accuracy at the word level, which means we can do simple keyword searches and expect that the results contain roughly 90% of what we're looking for. That's pretty good. And what's really exciting is that by doing some hand curation, we can start creating new OCR training data sets of the kind that Cordell and Smith call for in their report. Data sets with a wide variety of typefaces, layouts, languages, and usage patterns. Playbills are in fact a fantastic test case for the next generation of OCR engines because, since they are essentially advertisements, they deploy a huge range of eye-catching visual font effects, and those font effects change fairly quickly over time to maintain a sense of novelty to the public. But those OCR training data sets haven't been built yet. In the meantime, what can we do? For one thing, we can begin to ask questions about the other kinds of networks that govern the content of playbills, the relation of certain actors with certain roles, for instance, or tendency for certain plays to appear with other plays. Take, for instance, this playbill of Samuel Coleridge's tragedy Remorse, which played for a whopping 20 nights at the Drury Lane Theatre during its initial run in 1813. For 19 out of 20 of those nights, Remorse appeared with that year's Christmas pantomime, Harlequin and Humpo, where Harlequin must outwit Humpo, the king of the dwarfs, in order to save his love, Columbine, from being forced to marry Prince Humpino. Not the likeliest of pairings for a night at the theater, and yet the plays have uncanny similarities. We might start with visuals. Both Ordonio, the villain of Remorse, played by Alexander Ray, and Humpo, the villain of Harlequin and Humpo, played by William West, featured actors of short stature. Both plays contain implied critiques of Napoleon. Ordonio was a little usurper and would-be great man, as is Humpo, who stands in diminutive opposition to the quintessentially English Arthur. This is what we mean by the whole show at the theater, where diverse entertainments nevertheless coalesce. Finding these associations is now newly possible, or possible in new ways with OCR. By announcing specific people performing specific plays at a given day, time, and location, each playbill is a pin to the map of space and time. This means that several hundred might offer us the chance to trace particular entities not just across geographies, but also over time. One might, for example, track how a specific play premiered and traveled, such as Pixel Court's Coalina, which Thomas Holcroft imported as a tale of mystery from one metropole, Paris, to another, London, to great acclaim in the autumn of 1802. The following summer, we find it still in London, transferred to the Haymarket Summer Theatre, where we see it as the headline play before returning to Covent Garden as a repertory piece. Then, after a few seasons in London, we spot it first in Lancaster, where the play is described as, you can see it just above the title. Another click, got it. Thank you. A grand melodrama consisting of dialogue, music, and pantomime. Not a bad active definition to an audience about to experience a new dramatic form. By 1807, it hasn't just done the rounds. In Birmingham, it's become something reliable, the sort of play that actors choose for their benefit nights. It also proves a mainstay at the other great feeder theater, Bath. We see it here in its 1812 and 1824 runs, with more in the 1830s. Such tracking was possible with the British Library OCR, but always as a starting point for more intensive research. Essentially, you needed to assume that you were going to miss nearly half of what was really out there with each search, particularly with provincial playbills, which tend to be in poorer condition. Given our interest in how canons are formed and maintained, a 90% success rate makes it possible to track plays out into the provinces and back to understand their lives, deaths, and revivals and afterlives in motion. What excites us more is the potential we now have for tracking the movements of actors over time. By what circuitous routes did successful actors tour in the provinces? Did successful actors make to the London stage? Skip the line. Where did famous actors tour in the provinces? At what can this tell us about the development of a culture of celebrity as the 19th century turned? You want to? Okay.
All right, we're doing tag team. This is the part where I pretend I'm Scott. So the better OCR doesn't so much solve this problem as make it possible for a more precise kind of research. It becomes possible to track and plot a single actor's movements across, say, 100,000 playbills, and you can do that and put it in an Excel spreadsheet in about 3 hours. One actor, 3 hours, not bad. As a way of ending, then, let's consider the careers of 2 actors. The first is Elizabeth Farren, who reigned for nearly 3 decades as a singer and actress before marrying the Earl of Derby in 1797. We've chosen her because she represents a certain kind of established London star. She really was among the tercet with Sarah Siddons and Dorothy Jordan. She was huge. She often brought in much greater crowds, and yet she came from humble origins. She was the daughter of 2 itinerant strolling players. She was discovered first by Mr. Younger of Liverpool, the theater manager there, and he was casting her in adult starring roles as early as when she was 12. I like child labor laws. I just want to make that clear. We find her working full-time there and in Birmingham. The way to read this map is that the lighter the dot, the earlier it is. As the dots get darker, we go forward in time. We find her working full-time there and in Birmingham during the summers before making her first London appearance at the Haymarket Theatre in the summer of 1777. And then she does another season at Liverpool, and then, as the black dot will indicate, she sits herself down at Drury Lane and Haymarket for the next 30 years, basically, or 20. It could be that her itinerancy as a child and teenager made it so that she really never toured, not until she was about to marry the Earl of Derby, and then she did a farewell tour back to Birmingham, where really one of the first places she'd ever played. And the paycheck was nice. We'd like to contrast this with maybe, along with Carlo the Wonder Dog, my favorite actor in the London stage. And this is William West, Master Betty, the child prodigy who took, I swear I could say prodigy, who took London by storm in 1804. He was known as Master Betty or the Young Rocious. He had first debuted on the stage in Belfast, where he stunned audiences playing adult roles, usually Shakespeare, as an 11-year-old. Various memoirs narrate him triumphing next in Dublin, Edinburgh, and Glasgow before heading south via Birmingham, where he filled houses for 3 weeks. And you have to remember that war had just resumed with France. It's a really interesting time because everyone in London is looking south to France to see if Napoleon's going to invade, but they're also looking north because Betty's coming. And it feels that way if you read the newspapers. His London premiere created a sensation. Covent Garden Theatre can hold 3,300 people. On opening night, it had over 7,000 in there. They were hanging literally from the rafters. It was so bad that Drury Lane and Covent Garden needed to work out what is literally called a Betty sharing agreement. 2 weeks at each place. He was making £50 a night, which was 3 times what John Philip Kemble was making. He did this for 2 years, after which Betty reached puberty. London audiences moved on because he was now a teenager, a very good actor, but just a teenager. And the charm was broken, leaving Betty, and this is the map you're looking at, to work the provinces again till he went to university in 1812. Most narratives end there, noting that after he graduated from uni in 1812, he failed to revive his fame as an adult. Kids are cuter, I guess. Although acknowledged to be an extremely competent and often powerful actor, he was never able to procure a permanent gig at a major theater. He remained always a kind of freak show, a special attraction, strolling and arriving to a place for 3 to 12 performances, making good money and then moving on. This is what our OCR data captures. The details of this strange afterlife of his fame, which extends to some very unlikely places, such as Oswestry in Shropshire, Market Drayton, Stafford, Birmingham, and Dover, a weird sort of mirror image of his earlier southward march to fame. But then the strangest of all things happened, and I've not found a single scholar who even knew that this happened, so I'm kind of pleased. Retiring from the stage himself, William West Betty negotiated the debut of his own son, Henry Betty, the young son of the man once known as the Young Roches. And so far as we've been able to ascertain, no one has ever written on Henry Betty, but early Victorian audiences flocked to him the way that people in 1978 went to Beatlemania. And we've been able to track the beginnings and his adult career as an actor until around 1850. There are no pictures of him as a child. This is him as an adult. As the son of the Young Roches, Henry Betty played to sellout crowds in the very theaters where his father had triumphed earlier. It's the same, and here's the map. Oswestry, Bath, Market Drayton, Dover, and Birmingham. It's a sort of shadow tour, and it extended to Deptford, Swansea, Newbury, Ryde, Cork, Shrewsbury, Devonport, and finally Croydon, a strange place to end if you've ever been there. It makes us think that it would be a bit like Jacob Dylan playing the Newport Folk Festival, doing the same set as Dad did in 1965, and then pulling out an electric guitar. Given the poignancy of this last image, we'd better stop before you throw us out. But how many more stories are hidden in provincial playbills? We expect this is only a glimpse, and we really appreciate that you're listening and letting us share some of this with you. So thanks very much. I don't know, we might want to leave that up. Okay, here, I'll pull it though. And we can get out of Dodge. There you go. You're welcome.
All right, up next is Sarah Hovde. Sarah is a cataloger at the Folger Shakespeare Library, where she works with a wide array of post-1830 materials. I was very interested yesterday to learn that post-1830 is what modern, is at the Folger, particularly books and print ephemera. Previously, she was the graduate assistant for special collections cataloging at the University of Maryland, where she also obtained her MLS. So let's welcome Sarah. Okay, I will do that.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Laura, for organizing this, and to the NEH for funding it. So I'm here today to give a brief overview of the retrospective conversion effort that I've undertaken over the past few years with Folger Shakespeare Library's Playbill collection, and the sort of hybrid form it's taken during that time. So I'll discuss some of the major challenges it has faced, and some of the things we've learned along the way, and then explain its current status. So I have two caveats. One, that this is in many ways a cautionary tale, and two, that I don't have a background in theater history or Shakespeare, actually. I just happen to work with a lot of theater and Shakespeare. So I have a background in 19th and 20th century. Yes. By default, I sort of have one now. So I'm not going to get into the question of what is a playbill and what isn't a playbill. Most of the playbills in the Folger collection fit in both of these definitions. Items advertising plays, advertising performances. We do try to use terms from the art and architecture thesaurus whenever possible, but technically most of our items would meet that definition. Actually, the one on screen is probably more of a handbill. In person, it's only 12 centimeters. And then some of the examples later on might actually be considered posters. But for general purposes, it's all playbills for me. So the majority of the Folgers playbill collection, the 250,000 items that I'll be discussing today, were acquired by Henry and Emily Folger before the library opened in 1932. We have some additional playbills, about 7,000 as part of one named collection, and another 450 or so as part of another named collection. Those aren't considered part of the main playbill collection. So some playbills are bound in volumes, some are in scrapbooks, and occasionally as part of other manuscript collections or elsewhere. Most of them are stacked in boxes, separated by layers of tissue. Many are delicate and flaking, or permanently folded. Some do have nice housing and like mylar sleeves and things. This is probably the best kept box we have. And some are actually surprisingly sturdy for things that were not meant to last 2 centuries, I think. So the playbills are organized by geographic area, and at this point in this day, this kind of image might start to look familiar. So they're organized by geographic area, and it is a very logical system, provided that you take the 18th and 19th century London theatrical scene as the center of your universe, and then work your way outwards. So we've got London, provincial theaters in England, Edinburgh, Scottish provincial theaters, and then you sort of work your way out through the British Isles and then off to other continents. So right now, previously, they are described and accessible through a card catalog shelf list organized by call number, and then a card catalog main entry file, which is organized by location and theater name. The geographical organization and the creation of the catalog cards seem to have happened in the 1950s and 60s based on internal documentation. The mid-1970s, printed census lists were also created for some subsets of the collection, mainly the major London theaters in the early 19th century. For the last several decades, the card catalogs and printed lists were the main method of access to this collection. And so these are some examples of what they look like. In late 2016, the decision was made to start adding MARC records for playbills to the electronic catalog through an in-house retrospective conversion process, i.e. a cataloger would create records directly from the catalog cards without looking at the materials. Why then? For one, on a recent staff survey of cataloging priorities, the playbills were identified as one of the highest. They represent a known collection of underdescribed materials with good estimates of its parameters, which would make it seemingly easy to plan for. While we worried a little bit about the condition of the materials, we decided that the benefits of increased access outweighed the risks of increased circulation. And at the time, we were also expecting to bring on another curator who would have dealt with theatrical ephemera, and that has since been postponed. So initially, this was a very straightforward recon project with a few embellishments. I would create collection-level records from the card files using a constant data template in the connection cataloging software. As I went along, I would also establish authorized headings in the Library of Congress name authority file for as many theaters as I could. I would consult the playbills as little as possible to preserve their condition and also save time. While planning for the project, we looked at as many other playbill collections as we could find and consulted the documentation that was available for them. Many other collections are organized and described in archival finding aids. Some of them also have collection-level MARC records. These were not uncommon, and of course the two of them can exist in parallel. Ultimately, we did make the choice to create MARC records rather than finding aids, mainly due to greater staff knowledge and experience with that standard. And we reasoned that a parallel finding aid could be created at a later time if that was more appropriate. So to start, I formed a test cataloging run, creating collection-level records for London's Adelphi Theatre and Philadelphia's own Walnut Street Theatre, which were around the median in terms of numbers of playbills. I believe we have about 300 some from the Adelphi and maybe 100 from the Walnut. So I reviewed those records with my colleagues, approved the constant data template, and then estimated that the time to create records for the full collection would be about 18 months. I have paused for laughter in my notes here because that was ludicrously naive. So having tested and cleared the process, I just proceeded to dive straight in, working on it a few afternoons per week. Since the collection is sorted by geographic location, I decided to go ahead and start with theaters in the City of London. Thanks to the tens of thousands of playbills from the Theatres Royal at Covent Garden and Drury Lane, this is by far the physically largest portion of the collection. So each theater for which we hold more than 2 playbills is coded as a collection level record, and that does seem a little bit silly at times for collections of only 2 or 3 playbills. The record is given a devised title with a note indicating its source. The number of items in the collection is recorded, and this can be anywhere from 2 to about 10,000. And a summary of the contents is entered in a free text note. So I try to include as many structured data elements as possible to make the records more useful. Publication and performance locations are recorded as free text in a standardized form, and then are duplicated in an abbreviated form using standardized codes in the 008 and 043 fields, if anyone here speaks Mark. I add the name of a theater as a subject heading, and when appropriate, also in a main name heading as the entity responsible for the creation of the playbill. I also add a broad subject heading for theaters and the city, and then a genre heading for playbills. Much of this information is baked into the template that I created so that I don't forget to add any of it. I also add access points for any former owners and transfer any notes recorded on the card. For instance, if any of the playbills are facsimiles, duplicates, or are made of silk or satin, we have a few of those that are stored separately. So this is what it would look like live in our catalog. And to finish it off, I record the call numbers and accession numbers, plus an advisory statement warning users that this is unverified data from catalog cards. So you can sort of see that towards the upper third of the screen. If we have only one playbill from a theater, it actually gets an item level record recon, recon record, excuse me. Generally the same information as above, but it's coded as a single item rather than a collection. For these records, I do actually try to search in connection WorldCat to see if some other library has already cataloged a playbill for that theater and date. So if I actually found a result, I would check our physical item to see if it was a match. And this has only happened a few times, once for a playbill advertising a play put on by Charles Dickens at his home, Tavistock House, and then once or twice for playbills that were meant as political satires rather than genuine theatrical ephemera. So I know that this is by far not the ideal array of information about a set of playbills. Records don't include specific dates, plays, or actors, which unfortunately do tend to be what researchers look for more. But considering it's based on catalog cards, it's more structured data than was available before, and we hope that it's a starting point for researchers and other library users. So after completing the playbills for London, I moved north to Edinburgh, then to the rest of Scotland. After Scotland, I took a break to travel the world by cataloging the foreign playbills, which in our collection is everything outside of the British Commonwealth and the United States. It's very inadequate terminology. So then, feeling confident, I decided to attempt the English provincial theaters portion of the collection. So this makes it sound as though it was all smooth sailing, but in fact, the problems began almost immediately. The first challenge was that of establishing authorized name headings for all theaters, and this is where some background in theater history probably would have served me much better. I was surprised to realize that the name of the theater on the catalog card did not necessarily match the name of the theater on the playbill. For instance, the name of the theater didn't appear consistently on playbills themselves. Sometimes a previous cataloger made an executive decision and consolidated several variations under a single name. And many times the previous cataloger just chose the name that would fit best on the 3x5 catalog card. Excuse me. All very valid decisions at the time. However, under current cataloging standards, not as useful. So under the standard RDA, which is what we are using for these records, major name changes for the theater would each need to be established as a new identity. So with the example of the Walnut Street Theater, that's been known as the Olympic several times in its history, and also as the American Theater for a couple of decades. So those would all need to be established separately with links to current name, previous name, future name, etc. So it gets a bit complicated fast. And there's some guidance on determining what constitutes a major name change versus a minor one. It can be a little bit difficult to apply that in practice, and sometimes it's difficult to determine what the preferred name would be today just based on the catalog cards. And the two playbills on screen are examples from Cook's Royal Circus. And I actually encountered these about a year apart. And you'll notice, maybe you can see, that they're in slightly different towns, Edinburgh and then Birmingham, England. So I encountered these about a year apart and thought, wait, that name sounds really familiar. So it is the same group, but in different geographical locations. So once you've decided on the correct name for the theater and found enough information to confidently create a useful name authority record, there's actually the decision faced whether it should go in the Library of Congress name authority file or whether it should become a Library of Congress subject heading. And you'd think that would be more straightforward, but the Library of Congress subject heading manual actually directs you to establish theater buildings as subject authorities, theater companies as name authorities, with an exception for subject authorities that are needed for use as descriptive access points, which allows them to be established in the name authority file. And then we had several interesting philosophical discussions of conceptually, is a theater as organization distinct from a theater building and a theater company? And if so, where should it go? So once we sorted that out, the name authority creation process went fine, if not speedily, up until I started working on the provincial theaters. Most of the theaters listed on the cards were simply named after the town. For instance, the Kelso Theater in Kelso, the Ayr Theater in Ayr, or the Gilmerton Theater in Gilmerton. And I took this for granted until one day I needed to consult one of the playbills and saw that the theater described on the card as the X Theater was listed on the playbill as simply Theater X. Looking at some additional playbills in this portion of the collection, there appeared to be a significant amount of variance between the established, consistent, permanent theaters in towns and the limited run performances at local common areas such as inns or municipal buildings. And I think this was referred to earlier this morning, that there's a lot of traveling companies. You're not really necessarily going to get permanent theaters in every town. And I guess the main example of that is the Gilmerton Theater, which is really the theater located in the Man o' War large room, Gilmerton. So I realized then that the previous catalogers had essentially treated any theater as a permanent theater and described it as X Theater, which again is useful for finding playbills in a card catalog, but not nearly as useful for creating records in an electronic environment and establishing name headings for these theaters. So at this point, I had to admit that the name authorities portion of the project was no longer really feasible. I continued to use name headings for theaters when they had already been established in the name authority file, and to record them in the form in which they would be established, but not to actually go through and figure out what needed, what was a permanent theater, what was not, and what the name would have been. But I did track these theaters in a spreadsheet in the hope that one day they can be, in fact, either created as authorized headings or Wikipedia articles or some other form of useful data. The next challenge were the foreign playbills. Again, a very inadequate descriptor for everything outside of the British Commonwealth and the US. These initially were not a high priority. They're a fairly small portion of the collection, and our main focus is on England in the early modern period, Shakespeare, etc. Since we know that not all of the playbills in the collection are Shakespeare focused, we didn't think that this would be the best use of time. However, sometime into the conversion work, I realized that the cards for this set of playbills were actually missing from the main shelf list. There was a printed inventory, but I had reason to believe that it was incomplete. And so this set of playbills abruptly got moved up to the head of the queue. This necessitated a significant change in procedure. Since there were no cards to work from, it stopped being a recon project and became just an item-level cataloging project. And this was feasible since it's a relatively small number of items. This represents about 50 distinct theaters and performance locations, with only a few playbills from each theater. I think the most that we have is maybe 10 from one theater. So I was actually able to catalog these fully at the item level for the most part, and these records were not too different from the collection level records that I described earlier, but I was able to provide additional access points for printers, information about the plays advertised and the language of the text, and occasionally highlight actors. For instance, we have about a dozen playbills from Ira Aldridge's European tour in the 1850s. And there is actually a twist here. About a quarter of the way through this subset of playbills, I started noticing cards tucked into their housing. At first I thought these were mistakes, but eventually I realized this was in fact the shelf list for the playbills, filed in the boxes with the very items it was supposed to provide access to. So I don't know when or why this occurred, but it does explain where the shelf list went. So while I certainly would not recommend an item-level cataloging approach for most large collections, unless you have infinite staff time, in which case, go for it. It did benefit this particular sub-collection by allowing for more attention on underrepresented but very valuable items. Ultimately, the greatest challenge of the project was time management and morale. As mentioned before, my initial time estimate was very overly ambitious on its own, even assuming a consistent rate of uninterrupted work. Further complicating matters, the beginning of the Playbill project coincided with a major grant project, as well as some internal changes at the Folger. I also underestimated the nature of recon work. So where item-in-hand original cataloging often involves a great deal of research and analysis, recon work de-emphasizes that extra research and focuses on consistent, repetitive data entry. So alternating between original cataloging and recon work plus other duties as assigned quickly became very jarring. So I felt simultaneously that I was not giving the Playbill records the full attention that they needed and that they deserved, but also on the other hand that I wasn't making enough progress on the recon project. And then when I did spend time doing research for Playbill records, such as for name headings or working item in hand with the foreign playbills, I felt guilty for spending too much time on the individual theaters, even though I found it more filling at the same time. So some of the existing literature on retrospective conversion projects recommends considering participant morale in the in the planning phase of the project, and that was a step that I neglected. So I don't want to give the impression that this process was nothing but stress from beginning to end, because it was not. It's frequently very fulfilling. And I enjoy working with playbills just as objects and as artifacts. It has produced several positive outcomes. So overall, the primary goal of this project was to make the Playbill collection more findable in the online catalog, and that has in fact begun to happen. And we now have a much better sense of what the collection as a whole looks like, what theaters and geographical locations are represented within it, what the physical collection of the materials are, and how much effort will be needed to finish making it accessible in the online catalog. The playbills are absolutely fascinating objects for me, and working with them has suggested several possible research projects for the future. It's also led to a few posts for a couple of our Folger blogs, allowing us to share them with a wider audience, which is very satisfying. In a way, the project has almost been too successful. Creating the increased access to the playbills has also highlighted the very poor condition that some of them are in. The photograph that I shared earlier in the presentation of the stacks of playbills in the box, like I said, that was the nicest box that we have. Most of them are crumbling at the edges, stacked haphazardly. So it's really emphasized that they actually probably should not be circulating until they've had either preservation work, digitization, or there's some other solution in place. So we've sort of run headfirst into that tension between access and preservation. So due to this and a number of other factors, this is my twist ending, earlier this month we decided to put the Playbill project on hiatus for the immediate future. This is certainly somewhat disappointing and a touch anticlimactic to the presentation. This is certainly not what I had known when I proposed this presentation. But I'm hopeful that this will actually enable us to have a better long-term plan for the playbills when description is resumed, and we'll build on the work described here today. So if you're considering your own historic playbill metadata project of any kind, I hope this perspective has been helpful. And I have just one word of caution, in addition to the other words of caution. Consign yourself to a life of always spelling the word theater the wrong way. Whether you meant to spell it with an ER, you will spell it with an RE, and vice versa. Trust me. So thank you very much. I'm happy to talk more about playbills and cataloging. Yeah.
Laura is not going to introduce Laura. I'm going to introduce Laura. I'm going to introduce Laura in two ways. One, by reading a brief bio that is contributed by Laura, and then by improvising briefly, if she will permit me, because I would like to say something a little slightly off what is written here. This is the last presentation of the day, and sorry for the cliche, but this is absolutely not the least. This is the most, because Laura's the reason we're here. Let me read the formal part first. Laura Aydelotte is the director of the Philadelphia Playbills Project at Penn Libraries, where her curatorial work with the Folger Shakespeare Library collection, some of which is on view over there, led to an interest in the library's uncatalogued and hidden collection of playbills, some of which we've seen. Laura holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Chicago and is a scholar of medieval and Renaissance poetry and drama with publications on Shakespeare and early modern literature, one on geographies that it was literally just out 2 weeks ago at the MLA.
Women in Travel. It's a
Women in
great,
Travel,
great collection of essays.
Laura received her MLS from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and she's also worked at the Newberry Library in Chicago, where she was interim assistant director for the Center for Renaissance Studies. She's also worked at Princeton, where she was a consultant for the Lapidus Reperta project. Now, Laura has worked for Penn Libraries in a number of capacities for the past 4 years, and really has done a lot to help us think how digital humanities and libraries like ours can plot new routes together. For example, she came here to manage the Provenance Online project, or POP, as we familiarly call it, which is a fascinating project, not today's focus, but extraordinarily successful project on early modern and modern provenance. And of course, she's been managing the Playbills project for the last couple of years. So Laura writes about herself that she is passionate about sharing the many wonderful, whimsical, and profound aspects of material texts from across history, both in person with visitors and through digital projects with people all over the world. And I'd just like to say, as I've already hinted by improvising around this bio, that Laura has really done some extraordinary work here to push our department in new directions, to help us think about the old stuff in a lot of new ways, to help us sort of confront questions, some of which have come up today and other people at other institutions are also confronting, and really get us also to think seriously about partnering and partnerships. She's made friends with and friends for us in all kinds of institutions, both locally and nationally. Someone said earlier today that sometimes librarians and libraries are a little like this, a little close to the vest. We don't get out much, we don't. And Laura has busted through that wall to her and our credit. So I don't know. There will be other chances for this institution to say this, but I feel like I would like to say this now in front of you all, that this institution actually owes a lot to Laura for the work that she's done over the past few years, and this day is one wonderful piece of evidence for that. So now we're going to hear Laura on the Philadelphia Playbills Project, Year 1.
So John's going to get me tearing up right before I give this. No, that was a wonderful introduction. Thank you. So the Philadelphia Playbills project, at last, the project that brought us all together. And notice the National Endowment for Humanities logo right next to the Penn Library's logo, because these are the grant funding institution and the institution that made this project possible. I'm like Michael, experiment with the clicker. Look, I can click. So like many of the people who have presented today, I'm starting my presentation with the problem I think we've all now exhaustively acknowledged in this room. All these boxes of playbills back in our stacks. This is definitely where this project began. I was going back there saying, like, look, these things exist, and they're not in the catalog records, and how do you find them? And John dug up this, there was an Excel spreadsheet that somebody had come up with years ago, some intrepid person. But it's like 10,000 entries or something they put down for so there was an early pioneer who had gone through these and at least, yeah, just sat there with playbills and made just very, very brief, so at least we just knew they existed somewhere. But other than that, they were sitting in these boxes and what were we supposed to do with these things? What were we gonna do? As I said, briefly, and when I was talking about the materials over in Lee Library and the exhibit, the materials, the playbills that we ended up digitizing all came from the Horace Howard Furness collection. Furness was the editor of the New Variorum Shakespeare and a collector of Shakespeare and Shakespeareana. And his collection is one that there's a fund for, and we continually add Shakespeare-related things to this day. But so between the Furness collection, which not only has playbills but has editions of Shakespeare from throughout time, from Shakespeare's day to the present, has a rubber ducky of Hamlet. I mean, there's just everything in there that you could possibly think of related to Shakespeare. It's really a wonderful Shakespeare collection. So there's that collection, and then there's the Forrest collection of playbills as well. Who's the actor Edwin Forrest, the one with the burned first folio that we all just saw. So I was looking at these things, and you look at them, and that's a lot of text. I've intentionally made this almost illegible because this is kind of the way they come across sometimes. Is, oh my gosh, that's a lot of information. But boy, as other people have been describing today, would that make some interesting data. So if you're looking for data, Playbills will give it to you, more data than you ever wanted. They will also, as we've been talking about today, give you delightful things like this appearance of a living elephant at the Walnut Street Theater back in the day. I love the way that it follows a production of A Marriage of Figaro. So there's this great, kind of juxtaposition between the Mozart and the elephant. So and I thought, well, we've got playbills from British theaters and all over the place, but let's focus locally. Let's, when we were talking about earlier, sort of circumscribing these projects and what are your kind of what's your scope for the project? We decided to go with Philadelphia playbills in particular. And the two big theaters in the early days of Philadelphia were the Walnut Street Theater and the Chestnut Street Theater. As Sarah and others have been describing, when you're cataloging these things, you quickly realize I just put these lists up because these are all the different names that these theaters went by during the course of their history. So you can already see, as Sarah was saying, you think the theater is going to be a really obvious data point, like, oh, well, we just write the theater name down, but no, it's a little more complicated than that. And then you get the history of these theaters, so you can see that the Chestnut Street Theater had gas lights installed in 1816, and then there was a fire in 1820, and no idea if there was a connection between those two things, but for a while you've got the Chestnut Street Theater acting troupe acting in the Walnut Street Theater. What do you do with it? As we've been talking about, sometimes there's the things printed on the playbill, and then there's what was actually going on sort of informally. So do you call the theater the people? Is that, is this the group of people who acted in that theater? The theater is the physical building the theater. So there's all sorts of existential questions you can ask. But the Chestnut Street Theater, which doesn't exist anymore, was the oldest theater in Philadelphia. But the Walnut Street Theater does still exist. It still looks much the way it did in 2009 in this image on the right. This is 1809. So this was an earlier image, and it's the oldest continuously operating theater in America. So this also made these playbills, I was both interested in Philadelphia Playbills because it's local, and there's a wonderful, vibrant, rare book scene here in Philadelphia. Those of you who know the city know this. But also, and it can connect with wonderful collections like Karen's at the Free Library. But also because these are playbills that are documenting sort of this long history of theater in America in one of our nation's oldest theaters. So step one, you think, well, I want to get some pictures of these things so that we can do some kind of transcription project with them. And the first thing you know is that you've got to have some sort of catalog records in order to digitize. We got a sample set of 700 playbills, and we cataloged and digitized them in advance of the grant. But because, and this is a long story internal to Penn, but at that time, in order to digitize things, you needed a bib ID for each item in order for them to display right on the site and everything. So we ended up having to catalog them individually. And our cataloger, Elsa, back wearing the pink there, was the person who took on this great task. Yes, she deserves applause. And so we were kind of, we've been talking a lot about these projects in terms of, well, is it worth starting up a new thing because it's going to fail? And I think, one thing as humanists that we kind of forget, because, science used to just mean knowledge, and now it's sort of the scientists do things over here and the humanists do things over here. But in the period I study and sort of mentally live in a lot of the time, back in the 17th century or something, it was just knowledge. And I think scientists think a lot about the idea of experimentation and that of course you're going to do an experiment in your lab and things are going to fail, but you'll get something out of it, And I think that's definitely the way this project and I think that's often the value of these kinds of projects, is that it's a little bit like a lab. You go in and you experiment. So Elsa intrepidly went with me and experimented in how, well, let's just go in and see if we can create the best catalog records we know how to do, so that we can get them up here. So now they're up. You can go to the Print at Penn site and you can see the digitized images of these playbills. And if you click on that little tab that says more information, you get one of Elsa's wonderful records, and you can see she really went for it. So we've got the title where she's transcribed a lot, and she's figured out which theater is which. So we had a whole little sheet where we figured out which Philadelphia theater, what names went with each one. But it quickly became a question of like, well, how much time do I have? How many authority names do I put on here? There's a lot of stuff on these playbills. So this was our sort of first pass at thinking about these things as data, thinking about it at the cataloging stage. And as I say, we just sort of had to do them individually. I wouldn't actually recommend that as practice if you were doing a massive, large-scale digitization project, but it was really valuable because it kind of told us the things that were easy to do, the things that were really difficult to do, and I think it gave us some really valuable information. And we also have these great catalog records now, so at least for these 700, we have some unusually lovely records. But I thought, well, I want to do something even deeper with these things, because look at all that text. There's got to be something we can do with it. So the idea was for this grant that I've been working on for the last year, that you take a playbill, you transcribe it, and then you get data out of the other side. So we actually originally had proposed doing this in 3 ways. We were going to do crowdsourcing, we were going to have student workers, and we were going to try OCR. But as you've just heard, Michael and Scott have been doing such a great job with the OCR work that I think I'm letting them take that part of the experimentation over. So I've been concentrating on the crowdsourcing portion. So you, the audience members, can become part of the performance on the stage here. So there's a Zooniverse site for the Philadelphia Playbills project, where there's this lovely picture of Sarah Bernhardt looking at her skull. And you can go in and you can draw a little box around any part of the playbill you want to transcribe, and then the thing will pop up where you can type in the text that appears in that box. And as you can see, there's, I'm not sure if I can point. Can you see the cursor if I use it? Yeah. So you click on, say, in this case, performance date, and then you can, identify the date. Venue name will come up with a little yellow box so that you can, identify what types of things. So we're getting nice structured data out of this as opposed to just a you just transcribing everything as a blob of text. So we have, one place to put sort of things about the theater and the performance date, and then for each performance, you put in the title, the cast members, in this case, Mr. Booth playing Reuben Glenroy, whoever that was. So it's this, fairly efficient way for anybody out there, you're bored at home and watching TV and you want to transcribe playbills, you can do that. So it's been extended due to popular demand. You can join this crowdsourcing effort now through June 1st. I know that people are interested in this because they love playbills. They're interested if they teach. It's a great classroom exercise. I've had some interest in faculty for that reason. There's lots of, and these things, as we've been seeing throughout this whole conference, have so many sort of whimsical, interesting things to discover. It can also just be a nice, relaxing activity, even apart from research or pedagogical motivations. So do check us out on Zooniverse if you want to help with the transcription. So our other big approach was students and spreadsheets, and this is where is Samantha Pius in the room? There she is in the back. So she's the hero of this portion of the effort, because we said, well, we want to transcribe the playbill text in structured field with URIs. I'll explain exactly what that is in a minute. And so we want that data set, and that's been the really big work of the project. And then we also have, the dagger and those actors' images and all of that we saw in the exhibit over in the Lee Library. We already have digitized image of those in the Furness Theatrical Image Collection, and that has some sort of they're not actually in the OPEC, but there's some sort of informal but very well done catalog records that accompany those. So we already had some data and some images for those. So the idea was to make that a second data set and also enhance that with these URIs, which, as I say, I'll explain exactly what that is in just a moment. We based our data model on the Offstage data model, which was recommended by Doug Reside, and the goal was to get this into JSON LD format. So now I'll explain what JSON LD and URIs and all these things, because the non-technical people in the room are starting to think I'm going to sleep now. This link here, so the librarians know exactly what this is because it's a VIAF-ID. And the whole idea is that we're putting this data in a format where instead of storing it in a database at Penn and building a website that will someday be, a link that you click and it doesn't work, which will inevitably happen if we do. We may do that as well, but it'll be a temporary thing. The idea is that we're going to produce a data set that's in this linked data format. And linked data, the idea is that you have a URI, a uniform resource identifier for example, in this case, Edwin Booth, and you put that, you attach it to the transcription of the playbill you've made, you attach it to the skull that he used while performing Hamlet, you attach it to this picture of him using Hamlet, maybe you have a URI for the text of Hamlet, and so you connect the skull with the, with the play in that way. But you're drawing all of these things together, and the reason this is really important, I think this is my next slide, is that we all know once you get into the nitty-gritty, as Samantha Pius, who has now transcribed about over 600 of these things, definitely over 600. The first thing you notice, I think maybe possibly the first thing you said when we looked at these is, who is Mr. Francis and how on earth am I ever going to figure out who that is? Who is Mr. Jefferson? There's a whole Jefferson family of actors in Philadelphia. So as I say, the catalogers in the room are really familiar with this problem, but it's a problem that which was not feasible. We can't actually set our catalogers to doing this forever. We need to think about, well, how can other people use this as kind of a research activity? And Sam, in this case, is a recent PhD in medieval studies who knew nothing about playbills, but a lot about how to do really good research. And she's been helping to, we've been figuring out who these people are. And the whole idea is that we just transcribe exactly what's written on the playbill, and we use this URI, this unique identifier, to say, oh, that's this Mr. Jefferson Sr., who was born in 1820 or whatever. That you can differentiate between who these people are with these links, as opposed to having to somehow have some complex system where you, are putting it into the transcription. This is the Mr. Jefferson, and then, this is his alternate name, and so on. This is especially useful for women. In this case, this playbill was really helpful because it tells us that Rose Watkins was formerly Miss Rosina Shaw, but a lot of times we have women who have remarried up to 3 times, and their names just keep changing across the playbills. And you would never know it's the same person. So if somebody does the research to figure out or knows something about these actors, and they do the work to figure out, like, oh, these are all the same people, then we want to have a way of representing that by linking them all up to the same link, so that you can draw everything together. So here's an example. I don't usually do spreadsheets as slides, but this has been such a huge part of this project, and I thought some of the people in this audience might even be interested. So this is kind of the back-end equivalent of the snazzy crowdsourcing page I just showed you, where we're entering information about the performance, the title, the URI for the work if we know it, and then all the contributors, so the various performers, Mr. Wood, and in this case we do have a VIF ID for Mr. Wood, so we know exactly which Mr. Wood that is. So we've been entering those in. Sarah in her keynote brought up multi-page programs, and I just thought I'd add, because this is the first page verso of one of those multi-page programs with all these wonderful advertisements that you see in them. And so we also do have a kind of other text tab where we're at least recording sort of the name of the company or the object being advertised, whatever we think is most significant in this advertisement row. So all the different items are shown in this row that are like that lovely boot that's on sale and so on. So we are recording that kind of data as well, but all of this obviously had to be a long discussion about, well, what are the limits, what aren't we going to record? Are we going to actually transcribe all of the text to do with these advertisements? We decided that was a little overkill, but that you might want to know, that fedora dress shields are the best in the world. You could know that much. And so that's the transcription project we've been doing, transcribing these things, putting the different categories into spreadsheets. And then this is an example of the Furness theatrical image data I was just telling you about. So you saw, if you were in the exhibit over in Lee, we had another one of these great Morrison's Faust posters. They're these big color posters. And Lewis Morrison, which I told some of you while we were looking at the materials, was half black, half Jewish, and fought on both sides of the Civil War, and then became an actor here in Philadelphia and elsewhere. And so we have early playbills in the sort of mid-19th century in this project with where he's billed in sort of minor roles. And then towards the end of his career, he had his own acting troupe, and he was very famous for putting on a production of Faust. He's actually Mephistopheles, so he's the guy hiding in the tree here, looking devilish. Oh, what did I do? Okay. But this is basically an image from the Furness Theatrical Image Collection, and then this is the metadata that we already had attached to it. So unlike the transcription project, we didn't have to produce this metadata. This was already existing data attached to the images for our theater collection, but we have been doing the same kind of work with the URIs of adding these authority links to the data. And the payoff for that is that, you can start and we're sort of doing this, we've got the 2 data sets, the images and the playbills in-house. And the idea is that we can start, if we've got linked data for both of those, we can kind of model sort of internally, the idea that you could use this link to bring together, say, this fantastic picture of Edwin Forrest as Spartacus in the Gladiator, and this playbill documenting that production. You can bring together Edwin Booth and his dagger, and pictures of Edwin Booth, and the playbill, related to Macbeth, which I had up, in the exhibit hall. Fanny Kemble and the gloves that she thought belonged to Shakespeare that she gave to Furness, and the playbills where her name appears. So the playbill, in the way that I'm conceiving of this project, is acting as this very rich set of data, this very dense set of data that we're transcribing and producing, but with an eye towards it being kind of the hub to which we can attach all these other kinds of disparate theater objects, the realia, the images, we could go into newspapers, but I think that part of what I'm thinking about this project, we're focused on playbills, but I'm also thinking about how the playbill becomes the way of, springing off into, well, how can we digitally bring different collection items together in a way that will be more productive for theater historians than kind of like, I think maybe it was Karen, somebody was talking about being in their library and kind of, well, who's in charge of the opera material? Or, sometimes these things are actually just spread all across, even within one institution, they're spread in different places. So we're thinking about that in-house with these sort of 2 data sets that are being produced for the project. I'll get to that in a minute. But I think also the idea long term is that if you produce this kind of linked data at the Free Library, at NYPL, at Harvard, at the Folger, anywhere, all the people in this room, if you were producing any kind of theatrical data that also had Fanny Kemble's name in it, now the data that I've produced with the transcriptions of our Philadelphia playbills can be really easily shared through this link with other data sets at other institutions. So this is the end game, is that we're starting with these playbill transcriptions. So it's about transcribing the playbills and the theater history and all of that, but it's also about kind of creating this new kind of data that will make it much easier for us to collaborate in a virtual environment, so that when we're producing this data, it's not just something that's, just a database that's here at Penn that may or may not be maintained, but that's data that could conceivably be taken up and used elsewhere. So this is the big payoff for the project, is that we now have data, or we just about have data. Some people in the room won't be excited about this, but this is a JSON LD file. This is a playbill, everybody. And this is what all those spreadsheets that Sam has been working on across these many months and that our crowdsourcing efforts have been producing. We've now got a set of JSON LD files. LD means linked data, so that's the whole linking, easier to share version of the data that I'm talking about. And so the grant is coming to an end, and that means we've got our deliverables to deliver, and we're going to, on February 1st, coming to a GitHub page near you. There should be a data dump of these JSON LD files for both the 700s transcribed playbills, over 1,000 Furness theatrical image files. And we're going to include, I think on that site as well, there's just sort of a whitelist of identified names, because we've done a lot of work, figuring out who these actors are. So that could just be a useful bibliographic tool. And I'll provide a nice little write-up, a layman's account of what this data means and what the future for it could be. And, for those who aren't, coders who are pushing things to GitHub all the time, what this means is that we have data that we can now, going forward, build whatever bespoke project we might want to do at Penn. We could build a lovely website off of this data, we could do whatever we want, but it's also data that's shared, where it's really easy for a tech-savvy person to just go to GitHub, download it, and they can create their own project off of it. And this is something that we at Penn do a lot. We talk about, sharing the raw data as a way of preserving and sustaining a project like this, so that if you're putting data out in the world, and no, we're not going to be using JSON LD probably 100 years from now, but it's got a reasonably long shelf life. We think it's a pretty easy to read data format that we can expect developers will be able to utilize for the foreseeable future, so that this data can have a life outside of Penn. It's not just tied to the institution. It's out there where other people can use it if they're producing their own linked data sets, whether it's theater related or literature related or whatever. If it somehow coincides with the nodes that we have in ours, then it can become a part of their data as well. So that's the vision, is that we've produced this data and that going forward it can be the basis for projects here at Penn, but projects all over the country, all over the world. You could pick it up in Germany if you've got somebody who knows how to use GitHub. And so, this is my vision of a collaborative effort in which, and our data is so new that I wasn't even able to really get a good visualization going. But, if I had, it would have looked something like this with little, you've seen these things in lots of presentations where you've got Edwin Booth's, acted in Hamlet and things like that. But this is representing the data in the middle, connecting the playbills and these objects and all this performance history together. So now here's the fancy part of the presentation. Let's hope it works. I'll tell you about how this project is bringing theater history to life. My favorite playbill. It says Hamlet on the top and your life's in danger on the bottom. Thank you, Al.